The morning started like any other on our family farm in rural Iowa. I was checking the fence line along our northern pasture when I noticed something that made my stomach drop. Fresh surveyor's stakes, marked with bright orange flags, dotting the landscape like warning beacons. The stakes formed a clear line that cut directly through what had been our family's land for 3 generations. I stood there staring at those flags, my mind racing to make sense of what I was seeing. Dad had passed away 8 months ago, leaving the 320-acre farm to my brother Marcus and me as equal partners. We'd grown up working this land together, knew every fence post and drainage tile by heart. There was no reason for anyone to be surveying our property. My hands were shaking as I pulled out my phone to call Marcus. He'd been handling most of the paperwork and business decisions since Dad's death, claiming he wanted to take the burden off my shoulders while I grieved. I'd been grateful for his help, focusing instead on the day-to-day farm operations while he dealt with lawyers and accountants. The phone rang 4 times before going to voicemail. "Marcus, it's Sarah. I'm out at the North 40, and there are surveyor's stakes everywhere. Call me back immediately." I walked the entire perimeter marked by the stakes, my anxiety growing with each step. This wasn't just any 40 acres. This was some of our most productive land, the section that consistently produced the highest yields. If someone was surveying it, there had to be a reason. And if my brother knew about it and hadn't told me, there had to be an even bigger reason. The rest of the morning passed in a blur of worried speculation. Marcus didn't return my call, which was unusual. By lunchtime, I was convinced something was seriously wrong. 3 days passed without a word from Marcus. His phone went straight to voicemail, and when I drove to his house in town, his wife Jennifer claimed he was on a business trip, but couldn't say where or when he'd be back. Her nervous fidgeting and inability to meet my eyes told me she knew more than she was letting on. I spent those days researching property records at the county courthouse, trying to understand what was happening with our land. The clerk, Mrs. Henderson, had known our family for decades and seemed as confused as I was when she couldn't find any recent filings related to our property. According to official records, nothing had changed since Dad's death. But those surveyor's stakes told a different story. Each morning I walked out to check them, hoping they might have been removed. Instead, I found more evidence of activity. Tire tracks from heavy equipment, small piles of dirt where soil samples had been taken, and what looked like the beginning of a road being cleared through our timber. On the 4th day, I was in the barn fixing a broken gate when I heard vehicles pulling into our driveway. Through the dusty window, I could see 2 official-looking SUVs with government plates. My heart started pounding as I watched 3 people in business suits get out and walk toward the house. I quickly washed my hands and headed to the house, arriving at the front door just as they were preparing to knock. The woman in the lead was probably in her 50s, with graying hair pulled back in a professional bun, and the kind of no-nonsense expression that suggested she dealt with serious matters for a living. "Ms. Sarah Coleman?" she asked, consulting a document in her hand. "Yes, that's me. Can I help you?" "I'm Agent Patricia Wells with the USDA Office of Inspector General. We need to speak with you about some irregularities concerning your property." Block 3. Agent Wells and her colleagues followed me into our farmhouse kitchen, the same room where 4 generations of my family had made decisions about this land. The irony wasn't lost on me that we were now discussing what appeared to be the potential loss of that legacy around the same oak table where my great-grandfather had planned the farm's expansion during the Depression. "Ms. Coleman, we're investigating potential fraud related to USDA conservation programs," Agent Wells began, opening her briefcase and removing a thick file. "Specifically, fraudulent applications for Conservation Reserve Program payments using your property as collateral." I felt the room start to spin. The Conservation Reserve Program was a federal initiative that paid farmers to remove environmentally sensitive land from agricultural production. It was a legitimate program that many farmers in our area participated in, but the payments were substantial, sometimes thousands of dollars per acre annually. "I don't understand," I managed to say. "We've never applied for CRP payments. Our land is in active agricultural production. Agent Morrison, a younger man with serious dark eyes, leaned forward. According to our records, someone submitted applications for CRP enrollment on 40 acres of your property 6 months ago. The applications were approved, and payments totaling $127,000 have already been disbursed. The number was staggering. More than my annual salary from my job at the Agricultural Extension Office. But more importantly, the timing coincided perfectly with Dad's death and the period when Marcus had been handling all our paperwork. "Who submitted the applications?" I asked, though I was beginning to fear I already knew the answer. Agent Chang consulted his notes. The applications were submitted by Marcus Coleman, listed as the property owner and farm operator. All the documentation appeared to be in order. My brother's name hung in the air like an accusation. But there had to be more to this story, because the USDA agents wouldn't have come just for fraudulent paperwork. "There's something else, isn't there?" Agent Wells nodded grimly. "The land appears to have been sold to a development company." Block 4. The revelation that our land had been sold hit me like a physical blow. I gripped the edge of the kitchen table, trying to process what Agent Wells had just told me. 40 acres of our family farm, land that had been in our family since 1923, had been sold without my knowledge or consent. "That's impossible," I said, my voice shaking. "I never signed anything. I would never agree to sell any part of this farm." Agent Morrison pulled out another set of documents from his briefcase. "We have copies of the sale contract here. Your signature appears on all the relevant paperwork, along with your brother's." He slid the papers across the table to me. My hands trembled as I examined the documents. There, in black and white, was what appeared to be my signature on a contract selling 40 acres to Midwest Development Solutions for $8,000 per acre, a total of $320,000. The signature looked remarkably like mine, but I knew with absolute certainty that I had never seen these documents before. "This signature is forged," I said firmly. "I never signed these papers. I never even knew they existed until this moment." Agent Wells made notes in a small notebook. "That's what we suspected. The forensic analysis suggested it might not be authentic, which is why we're here. Mr. Coleman appears to have committed several federal crimes: fraudulent enrollment in government conservation programs, forgery, and potentially wire fraud. The scope of my brother's betrayal was becoming clearer, but I still couldn't understand how he'd pulled it off. "How is this even possible? Don't these sales require title searches and multiple signatures?" Agent Chang explained that Marcus had apparently created false documentation showing that he had bought out my share of the property shortly after Dad's death. Using forged documents and falsified affidavits, he'd convinced the title company that he was the sole owner of the entire farm. The development company believed they were dealing with the legitimate owner, Agent Wells added. "They paid the full purchase price into an escrow account, which your brother accessed 6 weeks ago. The money is gone." "Where is my brother now?" I asked. The three agents exchanged glances. "We were hoping you could tell us," Agent Wells replied. "He seems to have disappeared." Block 5. The word "disappeared" echoed in my mind as I tried to comprehend the full extent of what was happening. My brother hadn't just betrayed our family trust, he'd become a fugitive from federal law enforcement. The man I'd grown up with, who'd taught me to drive a tractor and helped me through Dad's cancer treatments, had transformed into someone I didn't recognize. Agent Morrison explained that Marcus's last known location was Cedar Rapids 3 weeks ago. He'd withdrawn a large sum of cash from his bank account, and his cell phone was disconnected shortly after. His wife claimed she didn't know where he was, but they suspected she wasn't being entirely truthful. I thought about Jennifer's nervous behavior when I'd gone to their house. She'd always been a terrible liar, but I'd assumed she was just uncomfortable with Marcus being away on business. Now I realized she'd been hiding the fact that her husband was running from federal investigators. Agent Wells continued questioning me about Marcus's recent behavior, his financial situation, and whether I'd noticed anything unusual in the months following Dad's death. As I answered their questions, a clearer picture began to emerge of how long Marcus had been planning this scheme. The timing wasn't coincidental. Dad's death had provided the perfect opportunity for Marcus to manipulate the inheritance process. As the older sibling and the one who'd stayed local while I went to college, he'd naturally assumed the role of estate executor. I'd been grateful for his willingness to handle the complex legal and financial details. "Did your brother have financial problems that you were aware of?" Agent Chang asked. I thought back over the past year, remembering conversations that had seemed innocent at the time but now took on sinister meaning. Marcus had mentioned having some cash flow problems with his construction business, but he downplayed their severity. He'd been struggling with his business, I admitted, but I had no idea things were bad enough to make him do something like this. Agent Wells closed her notebook and looked directly at me. "Ms. Coleman, your brother has committed multiple federal felonies, but there's also the matter of the land itself. The sale may not be legally valid, but untangling this mess will be complicated and expensive." Block 6, Agent Wells explained that the development company, Midwest Development Solutions, had moved quickly after the sale closed. They'd already obtained building permits, started clearing trees, and begun preliminary work on what appeared to be a residential subdivision. The 40 acres that had grown corn for nearly a century were being transformed into house lots. "Can't you just stop them?" I asked desperately. "If the sale was fraudulent, surely they have to stop construction and give us back our land." "It's not that simple," Agent Morrison replied. "The development company appears to be an innocent party in this fraud. They conducted due diligence, verified what they believed were legitimate ownership documents, and paid fair market value for the property. While the sale may ultimately be voided, they have legal rights that need to be respected." The complexity of the legal situation was overwhelming. Even if we could prove the sale was fraudulent and get the land back, the development company would likely sue for damages. They'd already invested significant money in permits, surveys, and construction preparation. Those costs could easily exceed the value of the land itself. Agent Chang added another troubling detail. There's also the matter of the CRP payments. The government will need to recover the $127,000 that was fraudulently obtained, plus penalties and interest. Since the payments were made based on your property being used as collateral, the USDA has a legitimate claim against the land itself. I felt trapped in a nightmare that kept getting worse. Not only had Marcus stolen our family's land, but his actions had created a web of legal and financial obligations that could potentially cost us the entire farm. The government wanted their money back. The development company had invested in what they believed was legitimately purchased land, and I was caught in the middle. "What are my options?" I asked, though I was beginning to fear that there might not be any good ones. Agent Wells's expression softened slightly. "Your best chance is to cooperate fully with our investigation and hope we can recover some of the stolen funds. If we can locate your brother and the money he took, it might be possible to unwind some of these transactions. And if you can't find him, then you'll likely need to hire attorneys and prepare for a long, expensive legal battle." Block 7. After the agents left, I sat alone in the kitchen staring at the business card Agent Wells had given me. The silence of the house felt different now, not peaceful, but ominous. Every family photo on the walls, every piece of furniture Dad had carefully maintained, every view out the windows that showed our fields and barns, now carried the weight of potential loss. I walked through the house touching things that might not be ours much longer. The antique china cabinet that had belonged to my great-grandmother, the handmade quilts that told the story of 4 generations of farm women, the collection of vintage farming implements that Dad had lovingly restored and displayed in his study. All of it could be lost if the legal battles went against us. Outside, I could see the surveyor's stakes in the distance, no longer mysterious, but now representing the visible boundary of my brother's betrayal. Beyond them, I could make out construction equipment that hadn't been there that morning, bulldozers and excavators that the development company was using to transform farmland into suburban lots. My phone rang, startling me out of my dark thoughts. The caller ID showed my Aunt Linda's number. She was Dad's sister and the only close family I had left besides Marcus. "Sarah, honey, I just heard something troubling from Margaret Henderson at the courthouse," Aunt Linda said without preamble. "She said there were federal agents asking questions about your farm. What's going on?" I took a deep breath and began explaining everything that had happened. Aunt Linda listened in stunned silence as I detailed Marcus's fraudulent schemes, the missing money, and the potential loss of the farm. When I finished, she was quiet for so long that I thought the call might have dropped. "That son of a bitch," she finally said, using language I'd never heard from her before. "Your father would be rolling in his grave if he knew what Marcus had done." Aunt Linda had worked as a paralegal for 30 years before retiring, and her legal knowledge proved invaluable as we discussed my options. She confirmed what the agents had told me. This was going to be a complex, expensive legal battle with no guaranteed outcome. "But Sarah," she added, "you can't just give up. This land represents everything our family worked for. You can't let Marcus's greed be the end of our family's legacy." Block 8. The next morning brought another unwelcome surprise. I was feeding cattle when I noticed a luxury sedan parked in our driveway. 2 men in expensive suits were examining the farmhouse and taking photographs. When they saw me approaching, the older of the two walked over with an apologetic expression. "Ms. Coleman, I'm Robert Winters from Midwest Development Solutions. This is my partner, James Chen. We understand there may be some complications with the property we recently purchased from your brother." I studied their faces, trying to gauge whether they were truly innocent parties in Marcus's scheme or sophisticated criminals who'd collaborated with him. They seemed genuinely concerned and professional, but my trust in people's appearances had been shattered by my brother's betrayal. "Complications is one way to put it," I replied carefully. "I assume the federal agents have been in contact with you." Mr. Chen nodded. "Agent Wells spoke with us yesterday. We want you to know that we had no idea there were any irregularities with the sale. All the documentation appeared legitimate, and we conducted standard due diligence procedures." They explained that their company specialized in converting agricultural land to residential developments in growing suburban areas. They'd identified our 40 acres as ideal for a subdivision due to its proximity to the expanding Cedar Rapids metropolitan area and its excellent soil conditions for construction. "We've already invested over $200,000 in permits, surveys, and preliminary site work," Mr. Winters said. "Our investors are expecting to break ground on the first phase of construction within 60 days. The timeline they described created additional urgency for resolving the legal issues. Every day that passed would likely increase their investment and make unwinding the transaction more expensive and complicated." "What are you willing to do to help resolve this situation?" I asked. Mr. Chen exchanged glances with his partner before answering. "We're prepared to cooperate fully with the investigation and provide any documentation that might help. We're also willing to discuss potential solutions that might work for everyone involved." "What kind of solutions?" "Mr. Winters pulled out a tablet and showed me detailed development plans for the property. "One possibility would be a partnership arrangement. If you're willing to legitimately sell the land, we could structure a deal that gives you a substantial ownership stake in the development project." The proposal was intriguing, but also felt like accepting defeat. I told them I needed time to think and consult with attorneys before making any decisions. Block 9. Finding the right attorney proved more challenging than I'd expected. Most local lawyers had experience with routine real estate transactions and estate planning, but the combination of federal fraud charges, agricultural law, and complex property disputes required specialized expertise that wasn't readily available in our rural area. Aunt Linda suggested I contact Professor Elizabeth Hartman at the University of Iowa Law School, who specialized in agricultural law and had written extensively about fraud in federal farm programs. Professor Hartman agreed to review my case and recommended a law firm in Des Moines that had experience with similar matters. The meeting with attorneys Margaret Sinclair and David Rodriguez was both enlightening and sobering. They confirmed that my legal situation was as complex as I'd feared, with multiple overlapping jurisdictions and competing claims on the property. "The good news is that signature analysis will likely prove the forgery," Ms. Sinclair explained. The bad news is that proving fraud doesn't automatically solve all your problems. The development company still has legitimate claims, the USDA still wants their money back, and your brother is still missing with hundreds of thousands of dollars. Mr. A2. Rodriguez outlined several potential strategies, each with significant costs and uncertain outcomes. We could fight to void the sale entirely, but that would require lengthy court proceedings and might ultimately leave us liable for the development company's losses. We could negotiate a settlement that gave the developers partial ownership while preserving some of the land for agricultural use. Or we could sell additional property to raise money for legal fees and restitution payments. What would you do if this was your family's land? I asked. Ms. Sinclair leaned back in her chair, considering the question carefully. Honestly, I'd probably try to negotiate a settlement that preserves as much of the farm as possible while minimizing your financial exposure. Fighting this battle to the end could cost you everything, even if you win on some of the legal issues. Their retainer alone would cost $25,000, money I didn't have without selling farm equipment or taking out loans against the remaining property. The total legal costs could easily reach 6 figures, and there was no guarantee of recovering those expenses even if we prevailed in court. As I drove home from Des Moines, I felt overwhelmed by the complexity of the decisions ahead. Every option involved significant sacrifices and risks. Block 10. 2 weeks after my meeting with the attorneys, I received a call that changed everything. Agent Wells informed me that they'd found Marcus in a small town in Montana, living under an assumed name and working construction jobs for cash. Local law enforcement had arrested him on the federal warrants, and he was being transported back to Iowa to face charges. He's indicated through his attorney that he's willing to cooperate with our investigation, Agent Wells explained. That could potentially help with asset recovery, depending on what he's done with the money. The news that Marcus had been caught brought a mixture of relief and sadness. Relief that he would finally face consequences for his actions, but sadness that our family had reached this point. The brother I'd grown up with was now a federal criminal, whose cooperation might be the key to saving what remained of our farm. 3 days later, I found myself in a sterile conference room at the federal courthouse, sitting across from Marcus for the first time since discovering his betrayal. He looked older and thinner than I remembered, with the haunted expression of someone who'd been running from consequences he couldn't escape. "Sarah, I'm so sorry," were the first words out of his mouth. "I never meant for it to go this far. I just needed some quick money to save my business, and I thought I could put everything back before you found out." His explanation poured out in a rush of guilt and desperation. His construction company had been failing for months, weighed down by bad debts and cost overruns on major projects. When Dad died and left us the farm, Marcus saw an opportunity to solve his financial problems temporarily. "I planned to pay everything back," he insisted. "The CRP payments were just supposed to buy me time to get the business back on track, and the land sale was only meant to be temporary. I was going to buy it back from the development company once I had the money." The naivety of his plan was staggering. He'd apparently believed he could manipulate complex federal programs and real estate transactions like personal loans that could be repaid when convenient. Agent Wells cut through Marcus's self-serving explanations to focus on asset recovery. "Mr. Coleman, we need to know exactly what you did with the money. Every dollar needs to be accounted for." Marcus provided a detailed breakdown. Most had gone to creditors, some to failed investments, and the remainder to living expenses during his attempt to disappear. Very little was recoverable. Block 11. The reality that almost none of the stolen money could be recovered forced me to confront the hardest decision of my life. I could continue fighting legal battles that might drag on for years and cost more than the remaining farm was worth, or I could accept the reality of our situation and try to salvage what I could. Marcus pled guilty to federal fraud charges in exchange for a reduced sentence and full cooperation with asset recovery efforts. His sentencing hearing was scheduled for 3 months later, with prosecutors recommending 5 to 7 years in federal prison. His construction business was liquidated to pay restitution, though the amounts recovered were minimal. After extensive negotiations involving my attorneys, the development company's lawyers, the USDA, and the U.S. Attorney's Office, we reached a complex settlement agreement. The development company would be allowed to proceed with their project on 30 acres, while 10 acres of the best farmland would be returned to me. I would receive a 15% ownership stake in the development project, providing ongoing income as houses were built and sold. The USDA agreed to accept $40,000 in restitution payments spread over 5 years, along with my agreement to participate in educational programs about fraud prevention in agricultural programs. They also waived penalties and interest in recognition of my cooperation and victim status. The financial terms weren't generous, but they allowed me to keep the core of the farm while avoiding bankruptcy. The lost 40 acres represented about $320,000 in land value and thousands of dollars in annual production, but the development partnership might eventually generate comparable income over time. More importantly, the settlement preserved 280 acres of our family farm for continued agricultural use. It wasn't the outcome I'd hoped for, but it was better than losing everything to legal fees and competing claims. The emotional cost was harder to quantify. The trust and partnership I'd shared with Marcus was destroyed beyond repair. Family gatherings would never be the same. Aunt Linda helped me understand that preserving most of the farm was actually a victory under the circumstances. "Your great-grandfather would be proud that you found a way to save the land," she told me. "Sometimes survival requires compromise." The 10 acres that were returned to me included the original farmhouse and the graves of 4 generations of my family. Whatever else happened, our roots would remain anchored in this soil. Block 12. 6 months after that terrible morning when I first saw the surveyor's stakes, I stood in the same spot looking out over dramatically changed landscape. Half of what had been our North 40 was now a construction site where the first phase of houses was taking shape. But the other half was growing corn again, and the income from my partnership in the development project was providing financial stability I hadn't had in years. Marcus was serving his sentence at a federal minimum security facility in Illinois. I'd visited him once, mainly to tell him that I forgave him for the sake of my own peace of mind. He looked broken by the consequences of his choices, and I found that my anger had been replaced by sadness for the person he'd become and the family relationships his actions had destroyed. The legal battle had taught me lessons about trust, family, and the importance of staying involved in decisions that affect your future. I'd hired a new attorney to review all our farm documents and had taken courses in agricultural business management to better understand the financial and legal aspects of farming. The development company had honored their commitments, and my partnership income was already exceeding what I'd earned from farming those 40 acres. Mr. Winters and Mr. Chen had become unlikely allies, and their expertise in land development was helping me explore options for carefully planned growth that could benefit both the farm and the surrounding community. Most importantly, I'd learned that sometimes the worst disasters can create opportunities for positive change. The crisis had forced me to become more knowledgeable about farm management, more careful about legal and financial decisions, and more appreciative of the land and legacy that remained. As I watched the sunset over fields that my great-grandfather had first planted, I felt a sense of continuity that Marcus's betrayal hadn't been able to destroy. The farm looked different now, with houses visible in the distance where corn used to grow. But the essential character of the place remained unchanged. The surveyor's stakes were long gone, but they'd marked more than just property boundaries. They'd marked the end of one chapter in our family's story and the beginning of another. It wasn't the chapter I would have chosen to write, but it was the one I had to work with. And sometimes that's enough.